Welcome back everyone. Today we're going to be making a flap top duffel handbag. This is a great project for all skill levels. In the tips I show you throughout the video, you're going to be able to utilize those on all your sewing projects. The finished bag measures in at about 17 by 12 by 11 inches. It's a good size bag for the gym or just a regular day work bag. So if you're new to the channel, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started supplies, you're going to want to grab yourself 2 yards for the outer layer, and I recommend grabbing a canvas, denim, or twill. Something that's heavier weight and it's going to add structure for your bag. These are all good fabrics to use. I'm going to be using a nice heavyweight canvas, but realistically, you can use whatever fabric you want. You'll need 1.5 yards to 2 yards for the lining. In the lining, I recommend a nice cotton or twill. I'm going to be using a nice soft twill. I personally like the heavier weight material on the inside and the outside, but you can also use lighter weight if you want to reduce the bulk. You'll need a vinyl or leather for the handle. Vinyl is going to be a little bit cheaper, and you have a lot of options when it comes to vinyl. I recommend getting about 1/2 yard of vinyl or 1/2 hide of leather if you choose that route. You'll need 2 to 2.5 yards of webbing. I'm going to be using a nice heavy duty 2-inch webbing. This is a fairly wide webbing. I'm going to be using it for the sides and the strap. And I like this nice wide webbing. It makes for a good shoulder strap, but you can use any size you like. But when you choose that size, keep in mind you have to choose the same size for the hardware. Moving into the hardware, you're going to need 2 D-rings, 1 slide adjuster, and 2 lobster clasps. And these are all based on the size webbing you're using. So if you're using 2-inch webbing, you're going to want to make sure you grab 2-inch hardware. Or else the hardware is going to be sliding around or it's going to be too small for your webbing. You're going to need 3 magnetic snaps or regular snaps. Since this is an open bag with a flap, it's easier to use a magnetic snap to make it more convenient to get in and out. And I'm going to be using 2 different types in the video, and we'll get to that later on. And I'll provide all the links below so you can gather your supplies before you start sewing. And lastly, you're going to need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is download it, print it, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And after you printed it out, the easiest thing to do is to cut off the top and the side edges, so that way you can easily overlap the pages and make for a more accurate pattern.
And this is an example of what your pattern should look like after taping it together. If you're having trouble lining it up, be sure to check your printer alignment.
So once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern printed out, it's time to move into cutting.
And after cutting, you should end up with 2 bottom body panels, 1 out of your main fabric and 1 out of your lining, 2 side body panels, 2 out of your main fabric and 2 out of your lining, 2 strap panels, and this is going to be cut out of a vinyl or a heavier weight fabric. Pick a fabric that won't fray. 2 flat panels out of your main fabric, 4 main body panels, 2 out of your main fabric and 2 out of your lining. And lastly, 4 strap end panels, and you're going to want to cut these out of vinyl or the same material you're using for the strap. Moving on to construction, grab your strap end panels and your strap panels, and we're going to place the strap end panels on the ends of the strap panels with the wrong sides together. And there's a few different ways you can do this. You can sew around the outside edges, or you can use an adhesive and glue them together. And for the video, we're going to use a spray adhesive. This is going to work best if you're using vinyl. The main goal is to keep those ends in place so we can sew the straps. Using the spray is super simple. All you have to do is spray it on and apply some pressure. And cutting out perfect matching end pieces is very hard. So after gluing your sewing, the best thing to do is trim up all the excess fabric so both the strap and the end panels match perfectly. This process can be a little bit tedious, but the nicer you make them, the better it will look on your bag. Next, we're going to roll the sides of the strap panel in twice, so that way we have a nice neat edge at the bottom. I'd recommend folding each side halfway and then fold directly in that halfway mark. Throw a few pins or clamps to hold it together. And I'm going to be using an edge presser foot for a lot of the top stitching on this bag. This one is adjustable, and it's super handy to get really nice, neat stitches. So using that edge stitch or just a regular presser foot, we're going to stitch along the edge as close as we can to that outside edge. It's best to take your time and make sure that both those sides are lined up evenly. This is the handle strap of the bag, and it's going to be right in the middle of everything, so you really want it to look as professional as possible. And the neat thing about these straps is that you can actually slide stabilizers into them, so that way you get more of a fixed handle look. It's also super easy to adjust the length if you're going for a shorter handle look, or even extend it for a longer handbag look. Next, we're going to attach them, so grab your main body panels. To start, we're just going to need the outer layers so the lining can go off to the side. To start, we're going to cut out the placement guides on the pattern. Cut out both sides, line it up on your pattern in the center, and trace out your placement guides. We're going to repeat this process for both of your main body panels. And we're also going to trace the flat placement guide, so mark each end and with the ruler connect the points. This mark is only going to be on one side, and on the opposite side of that mark, we're going to mark the button placement. It's key to make sure that these are on opposite panels. After marking, grab your completed straps, and we're going to place the ends on the placement guides. And this gives you a good idea on how high the straps are going to be, so from here you can adjust the straps to whatever height you like. Pin the straps on, and there's a few ways you can do this. The first I'm going to show you is by sewing around the outside edge. And I'm using the edge presser foot again to help get a nice straight stitch. I like to start by doing both of the sides and then coming back around and doing the top edge. Just free stitching like this can be very hard to get a nice straight stitch. Sometimes it's going to look sloppy. The next method is going to make for a neater look on just a regular free stitch sewing machine. So what we're going to be doing is adding a zigzag stitch on the same areas we stitched before. Set your machine to a very low length and a wide enough stitch so that way you can stitch that entire edge. You'll want to go back and forth a few times to make it a nice thick stitch. I used to use this method a lot for adding patches and other things to garments. It gives you a nice clean edge. From here, we're going to add a little bit more detail, and what we're going to do is add rivets. This will give strength and provide some style within that strap. I'm installing them with a press. You can also use pliers too. The first step is to punch out your holes, and I'm just using a standard hole punch that matches the size of my rivets. You can also cut holes too. Place your rivets in the holes, add your backs, and press it together. And as you can see, we're doing 2 per strap end. You can do 1 or 2 or as many as you like. And this is a really quick way to add a lot of detail to your bag. But feel free to do whatever method that works best for you. Moving on, grab the bottom panel, and you're only going to need your main fabric. And we're going to place it on our main body panel with right sides together, lining up the bottom, and sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Open up the panels with right sides facing up. And we're going to add a top stitch to that seam. Point the seam allowance towards the main body panel and add your top stitch. And using the edge presser foot, you're going to get the best results for top stitching. Also, matching the thread color with your fabric color really adds a lot. Grab the opposite main body panel, and we're going to place it on the opposite side of the bottom panel. Place the right sides together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And after stitching, we're going to do the same thing, add a top stitch by pointing the seam allowance towards the main body panel. So it's going to be pointing in the opposite direction of your last top stitch. With the right sides facing up, go ahead and look at your stitches, make sure you're satisfied, and you can skip the top stitches if you don't want that look, but it's totally up to you. Moving on, grab your side body panels, and you're only going to need your main fabric. Just like the main body panel, we're going to go ahead and mark our button placement. Make sure you're marking it on the right side of the fabric, and do it for both side body panels. We're not going to place the button just yet. We're actually going to wait till we have the bag complete with both of the lining and the main fabric layers together. Grab your webbing, and what we're going to do is lay it on our side panels and get the measurements. And I'm cutting 2 strips at 11 inches, but what we're doing is you can actually adjust this to your preference. So what you want to do is stay below the button placement guides. You can go lower or right up to that mark. Once you found that sweet spot, cut both of your strips the same size. And again, I cut mine at 11 inches. Place it on there, make sure it fits right with a little bit hanging over at the bottom. Lay them into position to double check, and then grab your D-rings. Make sure your D-rings match the size of your webbing, and what we're going to do is feed them on the top, roll the top edge over, and just make sure that D-ring does not go above the button marks. Once you're satisfied, pin it into position, and we're going to stitch the edges and add a couple bar tacks at the top. With the edge presser foot, I like to do both of the edges before I do the top. So I do one edge and flip it over to the other side and do the other edge. You can cut across the center if you want, but it's a little bit harder if you are using an edge presser foot. On flat surfaces, it tends to go on an angle, so it's best to just use this for edges. Repeat the same stitch for the other side panel. And from here, we're going to switch to a regular presser foot and add our bar tacks at the top. You can stitch as close as you want to the D-ring. I like to get one pretty close and then drop another one about a 1/4 inch down from that one. And of course, repeat the stitch for the other side panel. These stitches are very important. They're going to add a lot of strength on an area that takes a lot of tension. And you can totally add more than just 2 bar tack stitches. It really comes down to what you're going to be using this bag for. And using the same color thread really allows that strap to pop and hide any imperfections. Moving on, grab both of your completed side panels, and we're going to line the bottom edges up. with the center of the bottom panel. I like to use the webbing as a guide, so line it up with the center, place the right sides together. Do this for both of the side panels, and we're going to sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance along that bottom edge. And we're only sewing that bottom edge. This is going to help us line up that side panel so it turns out perfectly symmetrical. From here, we're going to stitch the side of the side panels to the side of the main panels. And to make sure it lines up evenly, I like to take the top of the side panel and line it up with the top of the main panel. And for the best results, I definitely recommend pinning these layers together. After pinning, you're going to sew each of the sides at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And you can start from the bottom or the top. I'm going to show you the first one. You start at the bottom and work your way up. In the second one, I'm going to start at the top and work my way towards the bottom. Either method works fine. This is another step where you just want to take your time and make sure that both of your sides are matching up correctly. From here, we're going to add a top stitch, so point your seam allowance towards the side panel. And we're going to add our top stitches just on the side seams, not on the bottom. If you are working with a post-bed machine, you totally can do the bottom edge if you'd like, but it can be a little bit tricky to access and make it look good on a regular domestic sewing machine. Repeat this process for all of your side seams, and feel free to skip this step if you don't want the top stitch. Snip off your webbing. You want to leave about a 1/4 inch. Flip the right sides out. We're going to do a quick check to make sure all the seams are looking good. At this point, your outer shell is getting pretty much close to being done, so it's best to check and make sure all the seams are good and there's no gaps. Next, we're going to grab both of the flap panels, place the right sides together, and we're going to sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the bottom edge. We're going to leave that top edge unstitched. And take your time around the corners, make sure you're trying to get a nice even curve. Before we flip the right sides out, we're going to do a few notches around the curves to reduce some of that bulk. You can do just slits, or you can go ahead and add full notches to really get some of that bulk out of there. After you're satisfied with the notches, we're going to flip the right sides out. And depending on your fabric you're using, it might be best to press out those edges to really get them looking nice and flat. After pressing, we're going to add a stitch around the outside edge. And you can stitch as close as you want to the outside edge. It's totally up to you and what preference you like. After stitching, we're going to add our button mark, and this can be added before or after. With the mark set, we're going to grab our magnetic snap, and there's different styles of magnetic snaps you can use. We're going to use a basic one for this flap. I like to use a smaller, skinnier side for the flap panel. Cut 2 slits for the back of the magnet, slide the magnet through, and add your back closure. And it's really that simple to add these magnetic snaps. But before we secure it down, we're going to add some fabric glue along the areas that we cut to prevent fraying. This isn't really going to bond with the metal, it's just to prevent fraying on the fabric. So line it up on the slots and then add your back and fold over the edges. And you don't have to do this step depending on what fabric you're using, it's just to safeguard for the future. You can fold the back ends in towards the middle or out towards the outside. Tug on it a little bit to make sure it's really secure, and from here, we're going to go ahead and add it onto the bag. Using the flap placement guide, we're going to place the top of the flap on that placement guide. The top edge will be pointing towards the inside of the bag. Pin it down to make sure it stays centered and add a stitch. I like to stitch as close as I can to the edge with getting both of the layers. And don't worry about that raw edge, we're going to take care of that in the next step. Flip the flap to cover up the opening, flatten it out as much as possible, and we're going to add a top stitch to that edge. And the key here is to go far enough in so that way you cover that raw edge on the inside. And this is a good technique to use to reduce bulk on that inside seam. And just take your time, this is going to be on the top of your bag so it's very noticeable, so you're going to want to make it nice and neat. From here, we're going to add the second half of that button to the mark on the main body panel. Cut your slots and make sure it's the opposite end that you used for the flap panel. Install it the same way you did as the flap panel. And later in the video, I'm going to show you a different style of magnetic snap you can use. After installing the bottom section, flip the flap over and lock it down. Just do a quick test to make sure that everything lines up. Moving on to the lining, grab your main body panels and your bottom body panel, place the right sides together, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're doing it the same way we did as the outer layer, but we're not going to be adding a top stitch. Grab the opposite main body panel, place the right sides together on the bottom body panel. On this seam, we're going to add a gap in the center so that way we can pull it back through later on. Make sure you leave that gap. Grab your side body panels and we're going to place the right sides together, lining up the bottom centers, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance the same way you did on the outer layer. you still want to make sure that you have the centers lined up. Moving on to the side seams, just like the outer layer, we're going to start at the top, add some pins, and make sure that the sides are perfectly aligned and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And doing the lining should go a little bit quicker because you don't have to add your top stitching, so cutting off that whole process really speeds up the time. Still take your time and make sure that everything is symmetrical. And after finishing the lining, we're going to set it off to the side, grab our main panel, and flip it inside out. From here, we're going to grab our lining, flip it right side out, and place it inside our main panel with the right sides together. The easiest way to do this is to place pins in the center of the side panels and making sure all the side seams line up. From here, we're going to stitch around the entire outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I like to keep my lining pointing towards the bottom so that way the feed dog will pull it and it will leave the outside edge getting pushed by the presser foot. This generally helps when you're using 2 different styles of fabric. Find the gap you made in the bottom panel of your lining, and we're going to pull the entire bag through that gap. This is definitely not a super easy process. I'm using a heavier weight fabric, so it takes a little bit more time really feeding it through that little hole. And after you have it all the way through, we're going to seal off that inside hole by folding the right sides together and adding a stitch to the edge. This is going to give us a nice clean edge on the inside of the bag. And matching the thread with your lining will really help hide that seam. Push the lining back towards the inside of the bag, lining up all of the panels. And to keep them lined up, it's best to place a few pins, and we're going to add a stitch around that top edge. In this stitch, you really don't want the layers to move at all, so adding pins is really going to be in your best interest. And I'm stitching at a 1/4 inch to the outside edge. This is what I have my presser foot set up as, so it matches all of the top stitching throughout my bag. And this is something I like to keep the same throughout the bag, so it adds for a symmetrical finish. This stitch also helps separate the lining from the outer layer and preventing that top edge from becoming so bulky. Moving on to the side panel buttons, we're going to add a different style here. Since the inside will be visible, I'm using snaps that are more like rivets and have a clean finished end. I'm going to be using a press to install them, but you can also use pliers. And they're installed the exact same way as the rivets earlier in the video. Punch your holes, feed your snaps through the holes, and press them down. Just make sure your magnetic ends are on the outside of the bag. And repeat this process for both of your side panels. And these buttons are to pull that side panel together to help close off the top opening and reduce any of the bulk in that top edge to make for a nice clean bag. And you can also add these buttons in the top handle so that way both of the handles stay together. Or you can add little attachments that lock the layers together. I just use a little piece of leather and those buttons, snap it together, and you're good to go. And again, add as much detail as you want to really make this bag your own. Moving on to the shoulder strap, grab your webbing and cut a yard. And this can be adjusted based on the size strap you want to make. Grab your strap slide adjuster and your lobster clasps. Start by feeding the webbing through the slide adjuster. You can feed either end of the webbing, and once you have it through, slide it down about 12 inches or so. On the same end, feed one of your clasps, and this is where it can get a little confusing. You're going to pull that end back through the slide, so feed some slack into that slide, feed the end into the outer opening first, and back down into the opposite opening. And this may look confusing, but once you do it a few times, it becomes super easy. Pull the end out as far as you would like, and we're going to actually stitch it to that same side. You can pull the slack back through the slide, and this technique will allow you to adjust the strap to different sizes. So before we move to the opposite end, we're going to add a stitch. And I'm doing a zigzag stitch here to really lock it down. Since I'm using thicker webbing, I'm not going to roll it over twice, so I'm just going to leave it flat and add a zigzag stitch. Grab the opposite end of your strap, feed your other clasp on, and do the same thing. Just fold it over once and add your stitch. And again, depending on the webbing you're using, you can go with a box stitch or a bar tack stitch, whatever works best for you. I just personally like the zigzag stitch look. And it's really that simple to make your strap. You can make different straps, more complex straps if you want. This is just a super simple way, so that way the webbing matches the webbing on your bag. And again, you can use different widths of webbing. I use 2-inch, I like the thicker look, but it's totally up to you and what style you're going for. In a quick test for this video, this bag does fit a lot of clothes. If you decide to use it for a gym bag or just a smaller travel bag, it's a really nice, convenient bag for all-around purposes.
And that's it, your flat duffel handbag is done. Thank you so much for watching and supporting the channel. It means so much to me. Hopefully you gathered a lot of tips and techniques from this video so you can really take your sewing to that next level. And all the little tips I show you throughout the video, you can transfer that to all your sewing projects. And that's why I like making these videos. Each video I like to add something new and something that's gonna really just be utilized in all of your sewing. If there's anything you wanna see or you want me to make, definitely send it my way. I'll try to make it happen for you. But until then, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.